Hi, women of welcome. Bree Sensrud here. We are going to have a conversation about the concerns of migrant kids at the border. We are going to be talking with the president of Bethany Christian Services here in just a second. Chris Palusky is going to be joining me here in just one moment. Hold on. Here we go. Let's wait for Chris to come in here. We're going to talk about all things migrant kids at the border. Hello, Chris. How are you?
Hey, Bree. How you doing today?
Good. Well, good. We know that you are one of the busiest men on the planet right now. So we are so thankful that you've decided to join us this morning. Okay, so I'm going to give a little context first before we dive into some questions. But one of the things I just want to make sure, women, that we are prefacing all of this with is that we are not asking people to choose between secure borders and taking care of children. We can do both. And as Christians, we are called to enter into these tension-filled spaces and do so in a Christ-like way. And I believe, as people created in the very likeness of God, we're actually made for this kind of work. And this isn't a pep talk here. This is truly how I believe Christians are to operate. This is how we're built. This is how we're created. And so let's continue to follow our compassion into this space and get some further confidence to do so. If you're just joining us, we're going to be talking with the president and CEO of Bethany Christian Services, Chris Palusky. He is with us right now. And we are going to be covering these things. We're going to be covering policies and processes. We're going to be covering challenges and concerns, and then ways to help. So, Chris, again, thank you for joining us. Okay, so let's first address this common phrase of we can't take everyone. And in the broader immigration scope, we would agree with that. We would say that we actually don't take everyone that comes to the border. But when it comes to children showing up at the border, we have laws that are actually designed to protect vulnerable children seeking asylum. And therefore, being law and order type of people, we follow those laws and we take in children who are claiming to be refugees. So what would you say to someone who would say we can't take in every child that comes to the border?
We shouldn't have to, and that's where I'd preface it, that, we need to look at the root cause of why these kids are coming. I mean, they're fleeing for their lives, their security. They're fleeing from places that are very unsafe and they can't stay. Second of all, these kids are here right now. So we've got to deal with this in almost a two-phase approach. Right now, we've got hemorrhaging going on. We've got kids that are here, that are in need of care. We need to show them the love and compassion of Jesus in a safe and loving home, safe environment. And we also need to deal with the root cause, which is why they're fleeing. Again, there's bad governance, there's lack of opportunity, there's no schooling, there's gang rule. There's all these issues that need to be dealt with. So you've got the short term right now, but you've also got the longer term, which we also need to invest in.
Right. Okay. So it's not necessarily that's not necessarily the question is should we take in children or not? It's these children are here. They are children made in the image of God. They are fleeing some incredibly extreme circumstances. And as our response as Christians, we can enter into this space and love kids well. And it doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice anything in order to enter into that well, right?
It's almost like if you think about the Good Samaritan. So, there was this guy who was on the side of the road. Maybe he was traveling in a place he shouldn't be traveling. We could say, oh, you know what? That guy shouldn't be traveling there. He shouldn't. What's he thinking? Well, no, the Good Samaritan said, boy, this person needs help. So he's taking care of the immediate. And that's what we need to do right now. We need to step up and take care of the immediate, which is taking care of vulnerable kids, and because they are here right now. But we need to look at the root cause of why they're fleeing and why they're coming and deal with that too.
I think that's perfectly stated and very good. If you're just joining us, we are talking with the president and CEO of Bethany Christian Services, Chris Palusky, and he is going to be covering policies, practices, challenges, what it means to enter in maybe as a transitional foster family. And we're going to get to all of those. And he's also addressing some concerns that a lot of women have in this space, a lot of people have in this space. And so we just answered the question about taking in every child that comes. Chris, walk us through the big picture process for unaccompanied minors, the way it's actually supposed to work from presenting at the border to then being connected with a family member in the US or a transitional foster family? How's that ideally supposed to work?
So ideally, you'd have a child or a family, they would travel to the border of the US. Usually they come from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. Mm-hmm. So they'd make this journey. They would come to the border. If it was an unaccompanied minor, meaning a kid by himself, he should be able to cross the border, present himself to the Border Patrol people. They would have him for a maximum of 72 hours while he goes through processing. He's then handed over to a group called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the US government. And the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, they would hand them over to a group like us and say, hey, can you temporarily hold on to these kids and help to find a parent in the United States or a family member or a family sponsor? And we do that on an average for 45 days. That's how long that typically takes. And we are 98% successful in finding those people.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So ideally a vulnerable child showing up to the border is taken in by Border Patrol or by Customs and Border Patrol officers. And then they are actually held, in what we're seeing is kind of these jail-like facilities that are being kind of overrun and overcrowded. And so really the law, because the Flores Agreement, which we've talked a lot about in this community, is that you're not allowed to hold children. You're supposed to hold them in the least restrictive setting possible. And if that's not possible, you need to only do that restrictive setting within 72 hours. And that child is then supposed to be placed in the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement and handed over to specialized child care NGOs, churches, ministries like Bethany Christian Services. And what we're seeing is all of these really frightening images of children laying on top of each other and having, I don't know, it's heartbreaking as parents to watch that being the situation of that's our country holding children in that way. So can you answer this? What are the biggest, you just said what the ideal process that was. We know the ideal process is not happening right now. You talked about how we're hemorrhaging at this point. What are your biggest current challenges to this ideal process? You and I have been on calls with the federal government. We've been able to be on some of these meetings that are so important to let us know what's happening. And some of these things we feel okay about, and some of these things we're like, this is not good enough. So what are the biggest challenges in your mind to this ideal process?
Well, I think it's overwhelmed right now. So you have a process and a system that's been dismantled to a great respect over the past several years. So we need to ramp that back up. We need to be able to have the foster homes. And also, there have been laws that have been put in place, some of them rightfully so, and some of them maybe not so much. But there's something called Title 42. And this is one of our biggest concerns right now. Mm-hmm. That means is that when a family comes to the border, they should legally be allowed to come across and go through the asylum seeking process to see if they're allowed to stay in the US. Well, right now, families are stopped and they're presented with almost a Sophie's choice. They can stay on the Mexican side of the border and it's very dangerous, squalid conditions, or they can send their kid across the border by himself as an unaccompanied minor. So that's why we're seeing so many children come across the border right now that kids are allowed to come, but their families are not. So parents are put in a very difficult position, but they're making the choice that they would rather send their child across the border alone than stay on the Mexican side of the border in very unsafe conditions.
So to be fair, I mean, in an effort to take in children, which we were not doing before this new administration, when we were expelling kids either back to Central America or we were expelling them back into Mexico to wait in these dangerous border towns. And this has just been a heyday for cartels and traffickers and whatnot. It's just, we're sending them back to starvation and to insecurity, to homelessness. And so the current administration said, okay, we're not going to do that to vulnerable children anymore. But yet, this was a perverse incentive in the fact that if you showed up as a family and you said, we're all in this together, and the government says the border is effectively closed under a Health and Human Services policy, which is Title 42, which says that we're not going to allow any entry into the country that might further expose U.S. citizens to COVID-19 or other health-related issues. So what you have is you have this like I said, this perverse incentive. Okay, so I can't get across, but it's not good for my child to sleep on the ground, could be kidnapped. We're struggling on food, health care, all of these things. So you're saying, all right, I don't want to be separated from my child, but we can't exist like this. So I know of somebody in America, whether that's my sister, my husband, my brother, whoever that is. And so I will send my child to the border by themselves. I mean, just imagine.
It's a Sophie's choice.
Yes, yes. So apart from this weird dichotomy here of just having to try and send your child without you, what else in the process is really challenging to that ideal process right now? So you've got an influx of kids showing up, and then what? What is some of the big plugs that are happening along that ideal process?
So these kids are allowed to come through, but there's not the mechanism for where the kids go because it's been dismantled. So
when you say dismantled, Chris, can you be more specific about that? Like, we know, what do you mean by it's been dismantled?
sure, and I'll talk about even maybe a little more broadly with unaccompanied refugee minors. So think of the Lost Boys of Sudan, or the unaccompanied minors, which are applying for status in the United States. The process for taking those kids in has been dismantled over the past several years. So where we were taking thousands of kids in, we ended up sending kids back to Mexico or their home country without due process. So groups like Bethany that had a lot of foster homes ready to go, we're now having to ramp up with our foster homes for the unaccompanied minors. Or if there were small bed shelters that were set up to take in unaccompanied children for short term, they were shut or they were emptied. So the mechanism for taking care of these kids has been dismantled. So now the government's trying to ramp up quickly. And so they're putting up some big bed shelters. They're putting up, I've heard in stadiums, they're putting up shelters for kids. We don't advocate for that, but we understand that there's an emergency condition, but we still don't advocate that kids should be put in 1,000 or 2,000 bed shelters. We advocate that kids should be put in small bed shelters, like 6 or 8 beds in a shelter, but most importantly in foster homes with loving families where they can be loved. And those mechanisms have been not totally dissolved, but almost totally dissolved over the past several years.
So we did have a system in place, and it worked well. And over the last several years, because we haven't been taking in refugees, that system of staffing, volunteers, venues, all of those things had to be shut down because there was no funding from the government to do that.
And then on top of that, so we were sending kids and families back to Mexico in many cases. And people were living in really squalid conditions in Mexico. So I went there about a year ago, before COVID hit. And I went to Tijuana and I was looking at some of these shelters. And I went into a warehouse, and it was a warehouse in a really bad part of town, and people had set up shop there. So there was tons of tents, primarily women and children. It had kind of that scent of urine, and it was dirty. So people were living in these conditions, and they have been living in these conditions for such a long time. Now they see the opportunity that maybe at least their kids can get out of this bad situation. And so there's almost a tidal wave of kids coming in because they see this as like, we can't live like this anymore. Our kids have been, in many cases, abused, neglected, and not taken care of because they just haven't had the means to do that.
Okay, so there is an overwhelming in the taking in of kids in CBP facilities, which are jail-like facilities that were actually designed and created for single men back in the 80s and 90s that were coming for economic opportunity and could be easily deported back to Mexico, and we're mostly from Mexico, and now we're seeing an influx of migrants from Central America. And so now the CBP jail-like facilities are being used as almost like small daycare centers, and they're overrun with all of these children. So what is the stopgap, the gap? You said that the ORR facilities where they're supposed to be going have been dismantled, and so there's this ramping up that needs to happen to meet the needs of kids to get them out of there. We're seeing that kids are staying in these facilities they're supposed to only stay for about 3 days, 2 to 3 days, but we're seeing anywhere from 10 to 14 days. So there's a ramp up there of the infrastructure to give them in different housing that's needed. In your assessment, in terms of child welfare, what is the current administration doing right? And what are the policies and practices that have you really concerned?
I think that they're taking an all hands on deck approach and saying, we are serious about this. So they're reaching out to groups like Bethany. They're reaching out to other faith-based actors, churches, other organizations that run refugee camps. They are looking at who can help out with this. So you are seeing, the big stadiums taking in kids. You're seeing the medium-sized places that maybe could take in 50 to 60 kids. They're taking in kids. They're helping us to ramp up for foster care and get some of our small bed shelters running again. So it's like they're looking at everything. It's a bit of a shotgun approach, and they're just seeing what they can hit. So I would say they are trying as best they can. What is my biggest concern? It goes back to Title 42. I mean, these children could be with their families, and they should be with their families. Mm-hmm. And they're be allowed to go through the legal asylum seeking process. We have laws. They should be entitled to our laws and function underneath that. Because there's a better way for this to happen. If a family can come across, there's alternatives to detention, meaning that the family can come across, they can apply for the asylum process, they can stay with a family member, or even churches pick up a lot of these families and help them walk through the asylum seeking process as the guidelines say. In fact, we have programs like this, and we had a 98% success rate in that, people going through the asylum seeking process. And it's in coordination with the church. Again, it's just a wonderful example of how the church can step up and be the hands and feet of Christ.
Right.
Either with an individual child or with a family.
Right. So in your mind, you're glad that they're taking in kids because you've seen the conditions that these kids are in. But you also are seeing that there's an overwhelming that's happening at the current facilities in the intake process. But then you're also you're concerned about Title 42 still being enacted, because Title 42 is really designed to protect American citizens from health concerns and being further exposed to, in this case, COVID-19. And yet what I will say, and what we have said to the community before, is that there are no migrants that are bringing COVID here. COVID is already in the country. And also those children who are being let in, they are being screened for COVID, are they not?
They are. And in fact, one of the advocacy points that we've had, and we've been really successful in many states, we are also making sure that foster parents who step up are at the front of the line for the vaccine. So we want to make sure that parents are protected, foster parents are protected, just in case anything could happen. So things are being put in place, and what we have heard is that they are being tested. But looking at some of the pictures with how the crowded conditions are, it does make you question of, how safe is it? The best thing that we can do is make sure that we have safe foster homes, facilities where kids can stay that aren't so congested, so that the kids won't become infected, the foster parents won't become infected, and the workers won't become infected.
Yes. Okay. So you talked about this just a little bit, but we see this erecting of temporary shelters. You talked about stadiums. And there has been some legitimate talk about utilizing hotels again, which seems really concerning. Thousands in our community actually signed a letter to the Trump administration back this summer when this type of housing and care structure was being put in place. It seems very frightening. Like, are we going back? Like, this doesn't seem better. And so what are you hearing, and what should we know about this?
So what we've heard is that the system of putting kids into hotels, I haven't heard anything about that. In fact, I was asking this morning if we knew anything about kids in hotels. We haven't heard that. What we have heard is that hotels are being rented out for families. So, which seems better than being in
yes.
a facility. Our only concern would be is that hotels turn into detention facilities. So people should have freedom to come and go. It shouldn't be a jail. So if it's a hotel and people have freedom of movement, it's better than the conditions that they're in. But I mean, there are caveats for that.
Yeah, and just go ahead.
That's not okay. That was wrong.
What would be the difference, just to explain it very crystal clearly, what is the difference of housing families in hotels versus how children were being housed in hotels back this summer?
So what I understand, and I never saw it myself, is that kids were being put in hotel rooms and they received food. It was just basically housing kids, and no different than a detention facility. They didn't have freedom of movement. They weren't given information, weren't able to contact parents. If a family's together, they can go through the asylum process together, at least it gives them a launching point to get to, where they need to go through that process. It's
Right.
not an immediate step, but during the summer, they were basically jails for kids as they were being deported back to Central America or Mexico. So it was almost like a stopgap measure of send them to the hotel and then send them back to where they came from. This, we're hoping, is that families could stay there for a small period of time, and then they will be allowed to go through the asylum seeking process, which takes a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I guess it's also my understanding that this past summer there was the staffing of those hotels was very secretive. It was not transparent at all. Kids were not given identification numbers, so they were trying not to keep track of how many kids they were having in those hotels. The oversight, we were told, is there was a simple background check for those staff members, those contractors that were watching over the kids, which, as you and I both know, a background check is the bare minimum requirement for taking care of or being around vulnerable children or children in general. So that was one thing. You want to say something?
I couldn't agree more. And that's why I was saying that it's one of the unique things about Bethany is we don't do these big shelters. We focus on either small homes or foster homes. And we surround the foster homes with, social workers. And we also make sure that kids have access to counselors, to telephone so they can call family members. Mm-hmm. So that, they have a variety of services that they get so that they are in a safe and loving home and they are receiving needed services. And these are kids that have been through so much trauma, especially the journeys that they've taken. They're some of the most traumatic things that I've heard about in my lifetime. And I've worked in disaster response for over 20 years.
Yeah, so there is a bit of a difference. And obviously, Women of Welcome, along with World Relief and Bethany Christian Services and some of these other National Association of Evangelicals, we're all really doing our best to enter into any of these meetings that we're invited into to, ask for transparency and learn as much as we can all together so that we're all, working on the same page and working towards the same thing. So one of the concerns that we hear from a lot of women in the community and a lot of just Americans in general is that there is a concern about the limitations of our current U.S. foster care system. And does care for unaccompanied migrant children negatively affect how we care for U.S. kids? There's been some stories that have surfaced that have been concerning that U.S. kids in foster care are either being neglected or being relocated because to make room for migrant children. What are we supposed to think about that? Talk to us about is that really a thing as far as U.S. foster care system? The limitations are such that, one kid suffers over the other?
I'll tell you how we deal with it. We have a both and approach. So Bethany, we've been working in foster care for decades. We've also been working with unaccompanied refugee minors for decades, because we find that there are special homes that want to take in an unaccompanied minor, and there's also special homes that want to take in a domestic foster kid. Usually the unaccompanied minor parent they want somebody there for a short period of time, and they're willing to help out for that short period of time. Sometimes with foster care, it's for a much longer period of time. So we've had a both and approach. And also, when we're looking at kids at Bethany, we know that we've got a ton of kids at the border right now. And our goal is just to show the love and compassion of Jesus Christ to kids, both domestically and kids from across the border. And we've been able to do both up until this point. So that's kind of at least how we approach it. It's a both and. It shouldn't be an either or. Again, these are kids that we're talking about. These are the ignored, the forgotten, and these are truly the ignored and the forgotten in the U.S. and also internationally.
Right. So, just to make that very clear, is that any stories that surface about U.S. foster kids being negatively impacted because of incoming migrant children, that is not the normal. That is not that's not the process.
No, that's not the process. And that's why I think, I haven't heard these stories yet, but what I'm understanding is that we do have a big influx right now. But if we could go through, and if Title 42 were to be eliminated, if we were able to look at the root causes, this would be almost a non-issue. Not a total non-issue, because you'll always have some influx of people coming across the border. But there are so many things that we need to do and focus on. And right now, our focus on it is working with vulnerable kids and children. And we haven't seen the impact on domestic foster care. In fact, it's interesting. I don't think it's telling, but the foster care numbers under the COVID crisis have leveled out. I don't know if that's because there's less reporting during the COVID crisis, but we haven't seen a huge increase of need. There's a big need in general. I mean, there's a need for 420,000 homes for foster care across the United States. And that's been pretty consistent for years. Right now we're seeing influx for the unaccompanied minors coming across the border. And we're hoping that this is an influx and we'll be able to look at some of the root causes to stop this from happening. Because this has happened before. I mean, this happened.
Right, this isn't new.
It's not new. This is the third bump that we've seen. It was under the Obama administration, it was under the Trump administration, and now it's under the Biden administration. So this is the third time that we've seen this happen. And it's about time that we look at the root cause of why this is happening. So if we don't look at the root causes, we'll see it happen again.
Right.
Inevitable.
Right. So obviously, put the UACs aside, the U.S. foster care system has always had this challenge of recruiting enough families. So are you concerned with this influx of migrant children that this is going to put a real huge strain on the U.S. foster care system?
You know, I haven't seen that yet. I think say that the U.S. foster care system isn't always under strain. I can't say that either, because you know what? That's one of our big things that we do. In fact, Bethany takes care of 8% of the foster kids in the state of Michigan. That's just an example. And it's a need, and it's going to be a continued need. So could it put stress on it? I think our country's stressed on so many angles right now, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't respond to the needs of vulnerable kids. And that's what we're about. So we will continue to recruit foster homes for vulnerable kids here in the U.S., and we will continue to recruit temporary foster homes for kids that are in need of a home, safe and loving place right now that are at the border.
Perfect. I love it. Okay, so let's get into this, because we've had messages of women who say, okay, because of what you've shared, I've started the process of becoming a transitional foster family. Tell us, what is the difference? So let's get into this, because some women are very interested about how they can actually help in this way, among other ways. But what's the difference between a transitional foster family and a typical foster family?
I think one similarity is they should be gritty. I mean, you know what? Because kids are kids, and these kids have all been through very difficult situations. So I think how we work more with the transitional foster care parents is we train them on trauma-based care, because these kids have been through trauma after trauma after trauma. So imagine this, a kid who's having to flee their country. And I'll give an example. There was this was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, I was in Honduras. I met with a man, and he had a daughter. He was thinking about coming to the United States. He said, I'm thinking about fleeing. I said, help me understand that. He said, I can't pay the gangs anymore. I don't have any money. And he had to pay the gangs for safety. He didn't pay the gangs for safety. Basically, they beat him up, or they did horrible things to his family. So he was told if he didn't pay the gangs, they were going to take his daughter, his young daughter, and put that daughter on the street and, quote, pimp her out. So that was his choice. And he was debating, you know, what he was going to do. But this is just like a common story you hear. So
I've heard it too.
And then people make this journey, which is just so unsafe. It's controlled by cartels. Many women and children are trafficked. They're taken, put into the industry, labor industry, used in just horrific ways. So by the time they reach the United States border, if they reach the United States border, they've been through trauma after trauma after trauma. So for parents who are wanting to step up and be transitional foster care parents, we train them in how do you work with a kid that's been through so many traumas? So I would say it's not so different than some of the traumas the kids have gone through the United States. I mean, with neglect and parents who are on drugs and just horrible things, but it's just truncated. I mean, these guys have been through one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. So I think parents have to go into eyes wide open that these kids have faced a lot of trauma. And I think that's a little bit different. Also, with foster care, normally it's for a longer period of time. And for transitional foster care, I usually think, 45 days is the average stay of a kid in a transitional foster care home, because our goal is always to reunite that child as quickly with either parents, which there usually are about 50% of the time. There usually is a parent in the United States, or with a family member or a family sponsor. So I would say the time difference is also something that somebody should think about when they're taking that on.
Okay. So does location matter? This is a question that's been asked. Do you need to be near the southern border to become a transitional foster family?
No. Great question. So there are offices throughout the United States. And if you go on Bethany.org, you can see which states were operational. And I think right now we're in 10, but there's also the USCCB, so the Catholics. They are also doing transitional foster care, and also LRIS, so Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. They are also doing transitional foster care. So we're trying to cover the whole United States.
Okay. So kids who present at the border can be facilitated to families across the country.
Yep. In fact, we have our largest programs in Michigan and
Okay.
also Pennsylvania. I mean,
Okay.
the border.
And you talked about this, the anticipated length of time a migrant child would be in your home if you became a transitional foster family would be 2 to 3 months?
That's the average. Now, you do have other cases. So I think people have to go into it eyes wide open, and you can request certain things, but there's also special needs out there. So I had actually a good friend. They took in a girl, and she had special needs. She had a kidney, her kidneys weren't functioning. She had just many health challenges, and that child stayed with them for a year.
Mm.
The average is 45 days.
Okay.
And
so if you, do you need to be active already in your state's foster care system?
no, but you need to. So there is, of course, the whole process that you go through, and it takes about 2 to 3 months. We are working with the U.S. government right now to advocate for truncating this process. We still want quality, and we want to make sure that children are in a safe and loving home and that they're being taken care of. But there are ways that we can expedite this process. But it typically takes around 2 to 3 months.
Okay. And what is the anticipated cost of going through that process?
Their time. So whatever their time is, that's the cost. In fact, when you have a child in your home, you actually get a stipend per day you have a child in your home, and it depends on the state, but I want to say it's around $50 to help cover costs and food. So it shouldn't cost the family anything at all to have that child in their home. We try to make it as easy as possible. Also, we try to provide services for the children, and also like the kids go to school during the day. And so if the parent's working, that works. The parent can continue to work. We also provide counseling. We also provide group counseling. We try to wrap that family around with as many services as possible so that it's not only not costly to them, but that they are getting the support that they need.
Okay. So what kind of, so you said kids are going to school. So you're trying to plug kids into a healthy environment. It's not like you're just at home with that child all the time, unless that's a real young child. Again, this is something that you talk about with your foster care representative as you go through the training, what you all are equipped to have and what you're equipped to do. So talk about like what kind of environment or space is needed to take in foster kids or migrant foster children. And I'll have you answer that one first, and then I have another question.
Sure. A safe and loving home.
Okay.
That's they need. There has to be a bedroom for the kid.
Can it be a bedroom that's shared with other kids, or does it have to be a bedroom by itself?
It depends on the state.
Okay.
So there's different regulations on that.
Okay.
Sometimes okay, and sometimes that's not okay.
Okay. So, in the U.S. foster care system, there is this big push to be able to take in sibling groups. So how frequent are sibling group placements or needs in the unaccompanied minor space?
That's our largest need. So
Okay.
Typically people are willing to take in one child, and we have many beds. In fact, we've got around 300 beds, and the majority of those are willing to take in one child. But
Okay.
what we're across the border is that parents will send their kids. So they'll send their, 13-year-old son with their 6-year-old daughter across the border. So we're trying to keep those families together as they're being reunited. So that there's a huge need for that.
Okay. So I was thinking about, I've got, young kids in my home. We're just really crazy and hectic and busy. And just thinking about, okay, so how might we logistically do this ourselves? And then immediately I thought about communication. What about Spanish speaking skills? Like, what do I need to be able to speak Spanish? This seems like a big need.
So it'd be great if you spoke Spanish. I mean, that would obviously,
Right.
but we do have translators on hand 24/7
Okay.
that will work things out either over the phone, over a FaceTime call, and we are always available for translation. Also,
Okay.
the kids are away at school during the day and learning basic English, so that helps out with some of the communication. So it's not necessary to speak Spanish
Okay.
to be a foster parent.
So kind of one of the big things I'm kind of hearing from you is showing up with what you have and talking with your Bethany Christian Service Agency or any of the other ones that you mentioned earlier. And we'll put these in the comments and the notes that you have that Chris mentioned some good sites to visit and some other Christian organizations that are doing this as well. But basically what I hear you saying is there's a lot of need, but just show up with what you have and we'll figure it out together. It's not that you're just kind of alone and getting placed with a child and there you go.
We will work with you. We will walk beside you in this journey. We just need people to really step up and be the hands and feet of Christ to some of the most vulnerable out there. And that's what we're about. We want to engage the church, the Big C church, to work with the ignored, the forgotten, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. And this is just a great opportunity in a crazy world that we have right now to come around something, to serve, it's the basic of the basic, love the Lord God with all your heart and your neighbors yourself. And this is a way people can do that.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So the last question is, not everyone can become a transitional foster family at this time. So what else can we do? If you're not in that spot, what are some really good things that you could do that would be really helpful?
Sure. First of all, we ask for prayer. We ask for prayer for the kids, for the families, for the situation. Second of all, get involved and get your church involved. So maybe somebody in your church is doing that. Well, maybe they're taking it's hard for that one family to do everything. So a church could come around, or a group, or a small group helped out with foster. And we helped a family provide that service. So you can help a family who's providing that service. Also, there's need for food, there's need for clothing, there's need for basic services. And maybe you can even help out with giving people a ride here and there now and then. It shouldn't be just left to an individual all the time. And at least in our mind, we see it as a community's decision to take on a family or a child.
So, that's kind of just like the traditional foster family situation. It's like you never want that family to go into it alone. There should be a community of people that are going to bring by meals, that are going to help with transportation to counseling appointments, that are going to contact your pastor and say, okay, this is needed this month. How can the church step in and support? So, when it comes to just fostering or adopting children in general, the journey doesn't end when the placement happens. That's when it begins. So is that something you wanted to mention too?
That was it. Just that it's, it really is all of community type thing. And also we see it as a great opportunity for churches or followers of Jesus to reach out. And so maybe you found out about, or you can find out about families who are going through the asylum seeking process. It can be very isolating. They're in a country, they're going through this process. The narrative hasn't always been great about these folks. They're usually just very humble families. I would say reach out to families or individuals who are going through this process and just provide them support, provide them friendship, get to know them. And it goes back to even with refugees. I have a heart for refugees. I love refugees. And people say, well, aren't these people coming here to take our jobs and they're all terrorists? And I say, do you know one? Get to know one. And then let's talk about it, because you know what? I've worked with it for years and I found them to be some of the most loving, caring, wanting to become part of the American dream as possible. So just get to know a refugee, get to know an immigrant, and that's a way you can help out.
Wonderful. Chris, this is so helpful. I think we've addressed some of the concerns. I think our organizations are going to be continuing to advocate. We will continue to enter into these meetings as we are invited and as we kind of push through ourselves. So is there anything else that you'd like to encourage this community with in terms of this whole entire narrative right now?
I think we need to change the narrative. You know, that's one of our advocacy points, and we've asked for it even at the highest levels. We were in a conversation with representatives from the White House. We've heard for so long that, you know, these kids are coming across the border and they're all gang members and they're all, you know, they're going to ravage your communities. These are kids. These are kids that are just have been put through hell. So I ask that we change the narrative on who they are and people get to know them and really reach out and be the hands and feet of Christ, because that's what we're called to do.
Chris, thank you so much. This was incredibly helpful. Ladies, we are going to post this in our news feed and you'll be able to see this. And then Bethany and Women of Welcome will be kind of watching the comments later on. And we know a lot of you watch this later on. And so we'll be managing the comments and trying to connect you as best we can in this conversation. And we're super thankful for so many of you that have taken. I'm not exactly sure if my home is fit, if my family is right, or if this is the right season, but I'm going to just inquire and I'm going to ask. And that's where we all just need to start. So we're thankful for you. We're thankful for Bethany. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.